February 1945, a frozen warehouse on the outskirts of Munich. Klaus Hoffmann, chief engineer at the Kruppersiksanstalt, Germany's primary weapons testing facility, stared at the objects laid out on the examination table before him. 3 American artillery shells, 155 millimeters, recovered from the Malmedy battlefield. They looked ordinary enough from the outside. Standard high explosive rounds, the kind that had been raining down on German positions for months. But these shells were different. They had been found unexploded, buried in the snow near the contested village. And the reports accompanying them were disturbing. Frontline soldiers described a new American weapon. Artillery shells that detonated in midair with perfect precision, raining shrapnel down from above. Shells that made foxholes and trenches useless. Shells that seemed to know exactly when to explode. The reports seemed impossible. Airburst artillery required precise, timing fuses calculated by experienced gun crews based on distance, altitude, weather conditions. Getting it right was difficult. Getting it right consistently was nearly impossible. And getting it right in the middle of a blizzard with poor visibility and chaotic battlefield conditions was beyond the capabilities of any army. Yet the Americans were apparently doing exactly that every single time. Hoffmann had been summoned to find out how. As he carefully began to disassemble the first shell, removing the nose cone to expose the fuse mechanism, Hoffmann had no idea that what he was about to discover would be more than just an explanation for a tactical problem. It would be a revelation about the true nature of the war Germany was losing. A war not of soldiers and tactics, but of scientific capability and industrial capacity on a scale that defied comprehension. Hoffmann worked methodically, photographing each step of the disassembly. His hands were steady despite the knowledge that even a dud artillery shell could be dangerous. One wrong move, one accidental trigger, and he would be scattered across the warehouse. When he finally removed the outer casing of the fuse assembly, he stopped. For a long moment, he simply stared. Inside the nose of the shell was a device unlike anything he had ever seen. A compact assembly of components precisely machined and carefully arranged. At first glance, it looked like a miniature radio set, which was impossible. Radios were delicate instruments. They required careful handling. The idea of putting one inside an artillery shell that would experience forces of 20,000 times gravity when fired was absurd. Hoffmann called over his assistant, Werner Steinbach, an electrical engineer who had worked for Siemens before the war. "Werner, come look at this. Tell me what you see." Steinbach leaned over the table, his eyes widening. "That is a radio transmitter and a receiver and what looks like an amplifier circuit." He paused, his voice becoming uncertain. "Herr Doctor, this cannot be right. These components should not survive being fired from a gun." Hoffmann nodded slowly, but they did. This shell was fired. The rifling marks on the casing prove it traveled through a barrel. Somehow, impossibly, this radio equipment survived the launch and remained functional. Over the next several hours, Hoffmann and his team carefully documented every component. There was a miniature vacuum tube, smaller than anything in German production, a battery system with a clever activation mechanism, an antenna that deployed after firing, a trigger circuit connected to the main explosive charge. As they mapped out the system, the function became clear. This was a proximity fuse. The transmitter sent out radio waves. When the shell approached the ground, the reflected waves would trigger detonation at the optimal altitude for an airburst. No calculations needed, no timing required. The shell itself decided when to explode. The elegance of the design was stunning. But as an engineer, Hoffmann immediately understood the implications, and they were terrifying. Hoffmann sat at his desk staring at the component analysis. Every part of the American fuse represented a significant engineering achievement. Taken together, they represented something beyond Germany's current capabilities. The vacuum tubes were the first problem. In 1945, German vacuum tubes were relatively large, fragile devices. They required careful handling and could not withstand significant shock. The Americans had somehow miniaturized them and ruggedized them to survive artillery launch. That alone suggested a level of manufacturing sophistication that was troubling. But it got worse. The battery system was brilliant. It used a glass vial filled with electrolyte. The force of firing the shell would shatter the vial, allowing the liquid to mix with the battery components and activate the power source. This meant the battery could be stored indefinitely without degradation, only becoming active when needed. German engineers had theorized about such a system, but implementing it required precision glasswork, carefully formulated electrolytes, and quality control standards that German factories, increasingly bombed and operating with forced labor, could no longer maintain. Hoffman called a meeting with his senior staff. Around the table sat some of Germany's most experienced weapons engineers. He laid out his findings. "Gentlemen, we are looking at a functional miniature radar set designed to survive being fired from an artillery piece. The Americans have solved problems we have been struggling with for years. The question before us is simple. Can we replicate this?" The discussion that followed was sobering. Every engineer present could see the brilliance of the design. Every engineer also understood that Germany could not build it. Wilhelm Schaefer, who specialized in electronics, shook his head. "The miniaturization alone is beyond us. Our vacuum tubes are too large, too fragile. To create tubes this small, while maintaining functionality and durability, would require manufacturing capabilities we do not have." Another engineer pointed to the materials analysis. "The casings are made of high-grade aluminum alloys. The circuitry uses copper that shows no signs of shortages or substitution. Every component is built to specifications we can no longer meet." Hoffman made notes. Then he asked the question that haunted him. "How many of these do you think the Americans have produced?" The room fell silent. Finally, Werner Steinbach spoke. "Based on the reports from the Ardennes, thousands, possibly tens of thousands. They're using them as standard ammunition across entire artillery batteries." Hoffman did a quick calculation. Each fuse required dozens of precision components. Vacuum tubes, resistors, capacitors, batteries, antenna assemblies, all manufactured to exacting standards, all assembled into a device small enough to fit in an artillery shell. And the Americans were producing them in massive quantities. "Gentlemen," Hoffman said quietly, "we need to understand what this means. The Americans have not just developed a new weapon. They have developed a production system capable of mass-producing complex electronics under wartime conditions. While we are struggling to make basic ammunition, they're turning out miniature radar sets by the thousands." One of the older engineers, a man who had worked in German industry since before World War I, spoke up. "Herr Doctor, with respect, I think you're underestimating the scale. If they can mass-produce something this complex, their industrial capacity exceeds anything we have imagined." Hoffman knew the engineer was right, and that realization led him to request something unusual: access to broader intelligence data on American production. 3 days later, Hoffman sat in a secure conference room with intelligence reports spread before him. What he read confirmed his worst fears and exceeded them. The American fuse program, codenamed VT for variable time, had been massive. Intelligence suggested it was one of the largest wartime projects, rivaling even the atomic bomb program in funding. The development had taken place at Johns Hopkins University's Applied Physics Laboratory, involving hundreds of scientists and engineers. But it was the production numbers that made Hoffman feel physically sick. By late 1944, American factories were producing approximately 40,000 proximity fuses per day. That was more sophisticated electronics than Germany's entire electronics industry could produce in a month. And these were not simple devices. Each one was a miniature marvel of engineering, more complex than most radios. The fuses were being manufactured at multiple facilities. Western Electric, a telephone company, had converted production lines to make them. So had other electronics manufacturers. The Americans had taken their peacetime industrial base, their experience with mass production of consumer electronics, and weaponized it. Hoffman pulled out German production figures for comparison. In 1944, Germany had produced approximately 40,000 aircraft total. The Americans were producing more proximity fuses than that every single day, and they were just artillery fuses, a small part of America's overall war production. Hoffman spent a week compiling his findings into a comprehensive report. He knew it would be unwelcome. The Nazi regime did not respond well to pessimistic assessments, but as a scientist, he felt obligated to present the truth as clearly as possible. His report concluded with a stark recommendation. Germany should seek immediate armistice before additional casualties are incurred in a war that can no longer be won. Hoffman's commanding officer read the report with a grim expression. "Klaus, you know this will be seen as defeatist, possibly treasonous." "Should I alter my findings?" Hoffman asked, knowing the answer. "No, the report is accurate. I will forward it through channels, but prepare yourself. The leadership does not like uncomfortable truths." The report was sent to the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the German High Command. Hoffman never received an official response, but through informal channels he heard it had been dismissed as excessively pessimistic and defeatist in nature. One general had reportedly said, "This engineer has been demoralized by enemy propaganda. The American fuse is a trick, a piece of luck, not evidence of systematic superiority." Hoffman was not surprised. He had seen this pattern before. Intelligence that contradicted Nazi ideology was rejected regardless of evidence. The regime had built itself on the premise of German technological and racial superiority. Admitting that America had surpassed Germany in industrial and scientific capability would undermine the entire ideological foundation. But Hoffman knew the truth. He had held the evidence in his hands. He had done the calculations. Germany was not losing because of inferior soldiers or flawed tactics. Germany was losing because it was fighting an industrial war against an enemy with overwhelming material advantage. The proximity fuse changed warfare forever. But its examination by German engineers revealed something even more important. The fatal consequences of valuing ideology over truth, of choosing comforting myths over uncomfortable mathematics. In the end, reality does not care what you believe. The smart shells proved that beyond any doubt. Klaus Hoffman was one of many German professionals who saw this truth and tried to communicate it. Like the others, he was ignored.